I built your life. I deserve half of everything." Those words were still ringing in my ears as I sat in that courthouse parking lot, gripping the steering wheel of my Ford pickup. 22 years of marriage, and my wife just told a judge she was entitled to $8.5 million of my money, half my construction company, and the ranch my grandfather homesteaded back in 1952. My name is Jake Coleman. I'm 51 years old, and I just watched the woman I married turn into someone I didn't recognize. But let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started, because it didn't happen overnight. We met in college when I was working construction summers to pay for engineering classes. Melissa was studying journalism back then, had this way of making even the boring stuff sound interesting. When I'd come home covered in concrete dust, she'd actually seem proud to be with a guy who worked with his hands. Said it was honest work, real work. That was 24 years ago. Different woman entirely. The warning signs started showing up about 8 months before that courthouse scene, on a Tuesday morning at the Riverside Shopping Center project in Cheyenne. I was standing there with my hard hat on, looking at a problem that was going to cost us time and money. The foundation crew had hit a layer of shale nobody expected to find. "Boss, what do you want us to do about this?" Jimmy Rodriguez, my lead excavator operator, was pointing at the rock face we'd just uncovered. 23 years old, good kid, but he was looking at me like this was the end of the world. "Well, I'll be damned, Jimmy. We've dealt with shale before," I told him. "Get the hydraulic breaker out here." That thing costs $800 a day to rent, but it'll save us 3 days of handpicking that rock. Sometimes you gotta spend money to make time. That's the thing about construction work. Problems show up every morning, and you solve them before lunch. You don't stand around wondering what might happen. You figure out what needs doing, and you do it. I'd been in this business for 25 years, started Coleman Construction right out of high school with a beat-up pickup truck and a toolbox my dad gave me. Built it from small residential jobs to major commercial projects across Wyoming. We had 45 employees now, doing about $12 million in revenue each year. Not bad for a kid who grew up fixing fence on a cattle ranch outside Casper. The crew got back to work, and that's when my phone rang. Melissa. "Jake, I was thinking we should update our insurance policies," she said. "You know, make sure everything's covered properly." "What brought this on?" "I just want to make sure we're protected." "How much depreciation do you claim on those excavators anyway?" Now, in 22 years of marriage, Melissa had never once asked about equipment depreciation. She knew I made good money, spent it freely enough, but business details had always bored her to tears. She used to change the subject whenever I talked about work. "About $40,000 a year per machine," I told her. "Why, and how many do you own outright?" 6. "Melissa, what's this really about?" "I'm just trying to understand your work better. You never really explained the financial side." Something in her voice didn't sit right with me, but I had a job site to run. "We'll talk about it tonight," I said and hung up. That evening, I got home around 7 after a 12-hour day. Melissa was in the kitchen, making dinner like always, but she had a notepad next to her on the counter. In all our years together, Melissa had never taken notes about anything I said. "What's with the notes?" I asked. "Oh, I'm just trying to understand your work better. You never really talk about the details." She started asking questions. How many active projects did we have? What was the total equipment worth? How much did we keep in the business accounts? For a woman who'd spent 2 decades saying construction talk put her to sleep, she sure was curious all of a sudden. "Since when are you interested in excavators and profit margins?" I asked. "I've been married to you for 22 years, Jake. Maybe it's time I understood what you actually do all day." But it wasn't curiosity in her voice. It was calculation. Like she was studying for a test I didn't know she was taking. Friday night was poker night. Same group every week for the past 10 years. Tony Ricci, my foreman who'd been with me for 18 years. Bill Crawford, who'd been my banker since college. And Ray Sullivan, who sold me most of my heavy equipment. We played at Bill's place. Nothing fancy, just $5 buy-in and plenty of talk about work, wives, and whatever was going on. Melissa's been asking a lot of questions about the business lately, I mentioned while Tony was dealing. Financial stuff, equipment values, things like that. "What kind of questions?" Bill asked. He had that careful tone bankers use when they're trying not to say something they're thinking. Detailed stuff, depreciation schedules, account balances, things she's never cared about before. Tony looked up from his cards. "Jake, when my ex started asking about the equipment values, I thought she was finally taking interest in the business. 6 months later, her lawyer knew more about my assets than my accountant did." "Come on, Tony, not everything's about your divorce." "I'm just saying, brother. When a wife starts asking about money she never cared about before, sometimes there's a reason, and it ain't usually a good one." Bill put his cards down. "You want me to take a look at how your accounts are set up, just to make sure everything's structured, right?" Structured for what? Protection. You've built a good business, Jake. Worth protecting from whatever might come down the road. I won that hand but couldn't focus on the next three. Kept thinking about Melissa's questions and Tony's warning. Maybe I was being paranoid, but 25 years in construction teaches you to pay attention when something doesn't feel solid. The following week, I came home early from the job site. I'd forgotten some blueprints I needed for a morning meeting. I walked into my home office and found Melissa going through my filing cabinet. She had her phone out taking pictures of contracts. "What are you doing?" I asked. She jumped like I'd caught her stealing. "I was looking for our tax documents. I thought I'd organize them better." "Tax documents are in the safe, Melissa. They always have been." "I know, I just thought maybe there were copies here." "Copies of what, exactly?" She got that look on her face, the one that meant I was being unreasonable. "Don't be so paranoid, Jake. I'm trying to help." But she wasn't trying to help. She was photographing my business contracts with her phone, standing there in my own office, lying to my face about it. That night, lying in bed next to a woman I'd been married to for 22 years, I realized something had changed between us. Something fundamental. The woman who used to be proud of my concrete-stained hands was now secretly documenting every dollar I made with them. I started paying closer attention after that, and what I found scared the hell out of me. The next morning, I called Greg Palmer. Greg had been handling my business legal work for 12 years, ever since I started landing the bigger commercial contracts. Smart guy, straight shooter, the kind of lawyer who tells you what you need to hear instead of what you want to hear. More importantly, he understood the construction business. "Greg, I think Melissa might be planning something. What should I do?" "What kind of something?" I told him about the questions, the note-taking, finding her photographing contracts. There was a long pause on the other end. "Jake, how long before Melissa can file and freeze everything?" "What do you mean, freeze everything?" "In Wyoming, she could file tomorrow if she wanted to. Once those papers are served, the court can freeze assets, prevent transfers, lock down everything until the settlement's final." That hit me like a cold slap. "How are my business assets structured right now?" "What do you mean structured?" "You own the company. I mean legally. Is everything in your name personally, or do you have corporate protections set up?" "It's just Coleman Construction. I own it, Melissa and I are married, so I guess she owns half." Another pause. "Jake, we need to meet. Today if possible. And don't discuss this conversation with anyone, especially Melissa." That afternoon, I drove out to Greg's office in downtown Cheyenne. He had papers spread across his desk, and that serious look lawyers get when they're about to give you expensive advice. "Here's the situation," he said. "In Wyoming, she's entitled to half of all marital property acquired during the marriage. That includes your business, equipment, real estate, everything. So if she files for divorce, she gets half of Coleman Construction? Unless we restructure things now, while you're still married and it's still your decision to make." Greg explained how we could create Coleman Holdings LLC, transfer the valuable assets there, and make Coleman Construction just an operating company. The real value would be in the holding company, which would be controlled by a family trust. "What about the ranch?" That was the big one. The 160 acres outside Casper that my grandfather had homesteaded in 1952. Dad taught me to drive on the old ranch road when I was 12. Every fence post on that property he and I had replaced together. It wasn't just land to me. It was 4 generations of Coleman sweat and dreams. We can put that in the family trust too, with a provision that it can only pass to blood relatives. If your marriage ends without children, it would eventually go to your nephew's kids in Colorado. The ranch was worth maybe $300,000 as raw land, but it was worth everything as family history. No way I was letting Melissa turn it into cash for some new life she was planning. How long would this take to set up? 2 weeks, maybe 3. But Jake, you need to understand something. If Melissa is planning what I think she's planning, timing is everything. Once she files, it's too late to protect anything. I signed the papers that day. Greg said he'd handle everything quietly, keep it between us until the structures were in place. Walking out of his office, I felt like I was planning for a war I wasn't sure was coming, but 25 years of solving problems had taught me it's better to fix the roof before the rain starts. Over the next few weeks, I watched Melissa more carefully. She was taking a lot of phone calls in the other room, always hanging up when I walked in. She'd started going out for lunch more often, claiming she was meeting friends I'd never heard of. "Who's Sandra again?" I asked one evening when she mentioned having lunch with her. "From my book club." "I thought the book club met on Thursday nights." "We do. This was just a lunch thing." "What book are you reading?" She got that irritated look again. "Why are you interrogating me, Jake?" I wasn't interrogating her. I was just asking normal questions a husband might ask. But everything felt different now. Every conversation felt like walking through a minefield where one wrong step could blow up my life. The worst part was dealing with Kyle Warren, my business partner. Kyle handled the architectural side of our projects, had been with the company for 14 years. We'd been through a lot together: market downturns, difficult clients, equipment failures. Hell, Kyle was at my dad's funeral, helped me carry the casket. And now, I was starting to wonder if he was part of whatever Melissa was planning. "How's the cash flow looking for next quarter?" he asked during one of our weekly planning meetings. "Fine." "Why?" "Just making sure we're solid for the spring projects. The Riverside Mall contract alone is worth $2.8 million. Want to make sure we can cover materials and payroll if any delays come up. We've never had cash flow problems, Kyle." "You know that." I know. "Just being careful. With interest rates going up, banks are getting tighter on construction loans." Kyle had access to most of our financial records as a partner, but he'd never been the type to worry about cash flow. That was my department. His job was to design buildings and make sure they didn't fall down. Then I noticed he'd been staying late more often, alone in the office when everyone else had gone home. One evening, I drove back to pick up some blueprints I'd forgotten and saw his truck still in the parking lot at 8:30. I used my key to get in through the back entrance and heard him on the phone in his office. "Yeah, the equipment valuations are all in the files I showed you," he was saying. "The real money's in the long-term contracts and the client relationships. Once we get the client list and the bonding capacity, we can undercut him on every future bid." I stood there listening, and my blood went cold. No, he doesn't suspect anything. Jake trusts everyone too much. Always has. That's his weakness. There was a pause, then Kyle laughed. "Don't worry about it. Once this is over, we'll have everything we need to start our own operation." Better than Coleman Construction ever was. I backed out of the building as quietly as I'd come in, drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Kyle Warren, my partner for 14 years, the man who'd helped carry my father's casket, was planning to steal my business. And from the sound of it, he wasn't working alone. When I got home, Melissa was in the living room watching television. Normal as could be. She asked how my day went, if I wanted some dinner, all the usual things. But now I was looking at her differently. Now I was wondering if Kyle had been talking to her. Now I understood why she'd been asking about client contracts and equipment values. That night, lying in bed next to a woman I'd been married to for 22 years, I realized I didn't know her at all anymore. I didn't know what she was planning or who she was planning it with. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was coming, I was going to be ready for it. The next morning, I called Greg Palmer again. "Those legal structures we discussed," I said. "How fast can you make them happen?" "I can have everything filed by Friday." "Why?" "Because I think we're running out of time." I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with, so I called Patricia Russo. Greg had recommended her, former police detective who'd gone private, specialized in financial fraud cases. The kind of person who could find out things you didn't want found. "Mr. Coleman, I'll need about 3 weeks to give you a complete picture," she told me during our first meeting. "But based on what you've described, I'd say you're smart to be asking questions." When spouses start building cases this carefully, they've usually been thinking about it a lot longer than you realize. While Patricia did her work, I kept my routine normal. Up at 5:30, coffee and the news, then off to whatever job site needed attention that day. But now I was paying attention to everything differently. Every phone call Melissa took in the other room, every time she left the house for one of her mysterious lunches, every question Kyle asked about the business. The hardest part was acting normal around Kyle. We'd been partners for 14 years. We used to go hunting every fall, talking about business plans while waiting for elk. He was at my dad's funeral, helped me carry the casket. And here he was, planning to steal everything my father had worked for. Some betrayals cut deeper because of the history behind them. 3 weeks later, Patricia called. "Mr. Coleman, can you meet me at my office this afternoon? We need to talk, and you're not going to like what I found." Her office was in a strip mall between a tax preparation place and a sandwich shop. Nothing fancy, just a desk, filing cabinets, and a computer. But the look on her face told me she'd found exactly what I'd hired her to find. "Your wife has been planning this divorce for 14 months, she said. "I found evidence of consultations with 3 different attorneys, 2 different private investigators, and a forensic accountant who specializes in business valuations." 14 months? The earliest consultation was in March of last year. "She's been building a case against you since before your father passed away." That hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. My dad had died in January, and I'd spent months dealing with grief and settling his estate. While I was handling funeral arrangements and transferring the ranch into my name, Melissa had been planning to take it all away. The woman who'd held my hand at Dad's graveside was already calculating how to steal his legacy. There's more, Patricia continued. Your wife has been having an affair with Kyle Warren for 10 months. She slid a folder across the desk. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, photographs of them together at places where they thought nobody would recognize them. Looking at that picture of them laughing over dinner at some restaurant in Laramie, I realized they weren't just planning to take my business. They were celebrating it. Kyle's been providing her with confidential business information. Financial statements, client contracts, equipment valuations, future project projections, everything she'd need to build a divorce case. Your wife photographed your business insurance policies. She knows exactly what equipment can be liquidated and what it's worth. I sat there staring at the photographs, my hand shaking so hard I couldn't hold the coffee cup steady. My wife and my business partner, planning my destruction while I was home thinking we were working through normal marriage problems. I followed them to 3 different hotels over 2 months, Patricia said. Kyle always paid cash, but he used his credit card for the restaurants afterward. Sloppy. They're planning to start a competing business after the divorce is finalized. Your wife gets the money from the settlement. Kyle provides the architectural services and client relationships he's developed while working for you. Can we prove Kyle violated his partnership agreement? Absolutely. He's breached his fiduciary duty to the company by sharing confidential information with someone who intended to use it against Coleman Construction. That's grounds for immediate termination of the partnership. I drove out to the ranch that evening. Needed space to think, away from the house where Melissa might be listening to every word I said. The ranch had always been my refuge, the place where I could see problems clearly and figure out solutions. I sat on the porch of the old cabin my grandfather had built and looked out over pasture land that had been in my family for 70 years. 3 generations of Colemans had worked this land, built their lives here. My grandfather had cleared the original 40 acres by hand, using a team of horses and sheer determination. Dad had expanded it to 160, adding the cattle operation that kept us going through the lean construction years when I was starting out. Now my wife and business partner thought they could take it away and use it to fund their new life together. That's when I made my decision. I called Greg Palmer from the ranch. Greg, they want to take everything. Let's give them exactly what they're asking for. What do you mean? I mean, when Melissa files for divorce, I'm going to agree to all her demands. Whatever she asks for, she gets. There was a long pause. Jake, what if this backfires? If something goes wrong with the legal structures, you could lose everything anyway. Greg, doing nothing guarantees I lose everything. This way I control the outcome. I explained my thinking. Melissa and Kyle had spent over a year building their case based on incomplete information. They knew what Coleman Construction looked like from the outside, but they didn't know about the new corporate structure. They thought I owned everything directly, but most of the valuable assets now belong to Coleman Holdings, LLC, and the Coleman Family Trust. Melissa thinks she's playing chess, but she's only seen half the board. Time to show her the pieces she doesn't know exist. When the judge awards her half of Coleman Construction, I told Greg, she's going to discover that Coleman Construction doesn't own much of anything anymore. The equipment, the client contracts, the real estate, it's all been transferred to entities she has no legal claim on. And the ranch, family trust, can only be inherited by blood relatives. I don't have the legal authority to give it to her even if I wanted to. That land stays Coleman land, period. Greg was quiet for a moment. It's risky, Jake. These kinds of strategies can backfire if a judge thinks you're trying to hide assets. I'm not hiding anything. Every transfer was legal, documented, and done while we were still married. I'm just protecting family assets the way any smart businessman would. The next morning, the divorce papers were served at the job site. The process server showed up while I was in the trailer with Tony Ricci, going over the schedule for the next week. Jake Coleman, that's me. He handed me the papers and walked away. Tony looked at me with concern. Bad news, boss? I opened the envelope and read Melissa's demands. $8.5 million, half of Coleman Construction, the ranch, and $12,000 a month in spousal support for 8 years. Every asset she knew about, calculated down to the dollar. Nope, I told Tony. This is exactly what I was expecting. Tony raised an eyebrow. You want to talk about it? Not much to say. My wife thinks she's about to become a very rich woman. And is she? I folded the papers and put them in my desk drawer. Tony, sometimes the best way to win a game is to let the other team think they're winning until it's too late for them to change strategy. What's that supposed to mean? It means Melissa and Kyle have been planning this for over a year, but they've been planning to steal something that doesn't belong to me anymore. That afternoon, I called Greg Palmer and told him to prepare our response. We were going to give Melissa everything she'd asked for, every single demand. And when she tried to collect, she was going to learn the difference between winning on paper and winning in reality. The courtroom was packed on the day of the final hearing. Melissa sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a black dress that probably cost more than most people made in a week. Her lawyer, a slick guy from Denver named Walsh, had flown in special for this case. He was already calculating his percentage of $8.5 million. Melissa was texting someone, probably Kyle, about their victory. Judge Andrews called our case, and Walsh stood up with his theatrical presentation. Melissa had built Jake Coleman's life, he argued. She'd supported his business ventures, managed their home, sacrificed her own career for his success. Now, she was entitled to her fair share of everything they'd built together. When Judge Andrews asked if I contested any of Melissa's demands, I surprised everyone in the room. No, Your Honor. I agree to all of them. Melissa's head snapped toward me. Walsh's confident smile died like someone had cut the power. Even Greg seemed startled, though we'd rehearsed this moment. You agree to the $8.5 million settlement? Judge Andrews asked. Yes, Your Honor. Half ownership of Coleman Construction? Yes, Your Honor. The ranch property? Yes, Your Honor. Melissa was smiling now, probably thinking she'd broken me completely. Kyle Warren, sitting in the gallery behind her, looked like he'd just won the biggest contract of his career. Walsh was frantically scribbling notes, probably adding up his fees. Judge Andrews reviewed the terms one more time, then signed the divorce decree. Mr. Coleman, you have 60 days to comply with the property transfers and financial settlements. That's when I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. Your Honor, there's one additional document I'd like to submit for the record. I handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Andrews. Inside were the corporate structure documents for Coleman Holdings, the trust paperwork for the ranch, and Patricia's investigative report documenting everything Melissa and Kyle had been doing for the past 14 months. Judge Andrews read for several minutes while the courtroom stayed quiet. When I pulled out that manila folder, Walsh's confident demeanor evaporated completely. I watched Melissa's smile fade as the judge's expression changed. Mr. Coleman, the judge said finally, it appears the assets your wife has been awarded may not be accessible in the manner she anticipated. That's correct, Your Honor, but I'm prepared to honor the spirit of the settlement with a revised offer. I turned to face Melissa directly. $800,000 cash and you walk away from everything else. Take it or spend the next 5 years in court trying to break legal structures that can't be broken. Her face went white. Walsh requested an immediate recess to review the documents I'd submitted. When they came back 30 minutes later, Melissa looked like she'd aged 10 years. Your Honor, Walsh said, his voice barely steady, my client would like to accept Mr. Coleman's revised settlement offer. Judge Andrews looked at Melissa. Mrs. Coleman, do you understand you're accepting $800,000 instead of the $8.5 million previously awarded? Melissa's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. The papers were signed that afternoon. Kyle's buyout happened 3 days later. His partnership share in Coleman Construction came to $45,000 at book value. All those client relationships he thought he'd be taking with him stayed right where they belonged. Greg handled Kyle's transaction professionally, but I knew it destroyed their family relationship. Kyle packed up his office that weekend and left Wyoming. Word travels fast in the Wyoming construction business. No one would hire an architect who'd betrayed his own partner. He never came back. Melissa tried to contest the trust documents, but after 6 months and $60,000 in legal fees, her new lawyer advised her to give up. She took her money and moved to Colorado within the week. I heard later she tried to start that interior design business they'd been planning, but it failed within 6 months. Turns out stealing someone else's money doesn't automatically give you the skills to run a company. The negative publicity from the restraining order and divorce proceedings faded pretty quickly once people understood what had really happened. Clients came back, employees relaxed, and we landed the biggest contract in company history that fall, a new hospital complex in Casper. These days I spend more time at the ranch. Fixed up the old cabin my grandfather built, put in a new roof, and updated the plumbing while keeping the original logs and stone foundation. Friday evenings, I drive out there and sit on the porch, looking out over land that's been in my family for 70 years. Tony Ricci is running more of the day-to-day operations now. Good man, understands the business, earned the promotion. He's got the same work ethic I had at his age, the same respect from the crews. Bill Crawford helped me restructure the company finances so we're stronger than ever. Ray Sullivan still sells me equipment and beats me at poker most Friday nights. though he jokes that he's nervous about what other legal tricks I might have up my sleeve. I never remarried. Some betrayals teach you things about trust that change how you see relationships, but I built a good life anyway. The business is thriving, the ranch is exactly where it should be, and I learned something important about protecting what matters. Last month, my nephew brought his kids out to the ranch for a weekend. 8 and 10 years old, first time they'd been on a horse, first time they'd caught a trout in the creek that runs through the back 40. The 10-year-old asked me how long our family had owned the land. 70 years, I told him. Your great-great-grandfather homesteaded this place in 1952. Will it always be ours? As long as there are Colemans who want it, son. That's what family land means. Tony's oldest boy just graduated engineering school. Kid's got good instincts and a solid work ethic. He's been working summers with us since he was 16, knows the business from the ground up. Maybe Coleman Construction will skip a generation, but it won't skip the values. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized Melissa and Kyle made one crucial mistake. They thought success was something you could steal from someone else, that 25 years of hard work was just luck they deserved a piece of. They never understood that building something real takes more than wanting what someone else has. It takes getting up every morning and doing the work, solving the problems, earning the respect of people who matter. I learned the difference between being trusting and being foolish. Trust people, but verify their actions. And always protect what you can't afford to lose. If you're a man who's built something worth having, there's always someone figuring out how to take it. Your job is to be smarter than they are. Some people think the best revenge is getting even with folks who try to destroy you. I learned something different. The best revenge is simply refusing to be destroyed. When someone tries to take everything you've built and you're still standing when the dust settles, that's not just winning. That's proving something about who you are and what you're made of. That's worth more than all the money they tried to steal.